Welcome once more to my channel. Today we are going to be looking at consumers and producers surplus. Consumer surplus, as you can see on the board, refers to the difference between the price consumers are willing and able to pay for a good or service and the price they actually pay. So, how is this illustrated on a curve? Since we are talking about consumers surplus, we'll be looking at a demand curve. Very important to note for especially those who are writing the GCE examination. A very important topic. So, since we are talking about consumer surplus, we draw a demand curve. You are not drawing a producer's or a supply curve to explain consumer surplus. No, it doesn't work that way. So, we draw a demand curve. We don't just draw a demand curve. The demand curve has to be touching the y-axis. Remember how to draw a demand curve? We have the y and the x-axis. The demand curve has to be touching the y-axis as mine is shown here. So this is a normal demand curve that has been drawn with price and quantity illustrated on the curve. So at this price, consumers actually buy. But before coming to the market, this portion A, B signifies that there are so many consumers or consumers are willing to buy above this price of P1. This could be illustrated with a number. Let's say this is 500. Consumers are willing to buy above 500, maybe 600, 700. But upon reaching the market, they realize that the price is 500. So that is a surplus. That is a surplus. So if we want to illustrate this, let's say the consumer surplus, let's say CS1 will be this portion P1 A B P1 A B. Why? Because it is that portion below the demand curve and above the price line. The portion below the demand curve and above the price line. So that is how we identify the consumer surplus. Now, what will happen to the consumer surplus portion if the price increase? For example, if price changes and the change is that it increases from P1 to P2. What will happen is that the surplus that consumers were receiving before will now drop. Okay, it will drop. You were buying a good for 500 francs, but the price increased to 1,000. The surplus you were making in the market as a consumer will drop. So this is illustrated like this. We have Q2. So now the new portion will be, the new portion for the consumer surplus will now be, remember it is always below the demand curve, and above the price line. So this will be it, P2AC. Below the demand curve, P2AC. We just decided to denote this point as C. So what will happen again if price drops to P3? What will be the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus will increase. Wow, consumers will be very happy. Price has dropped, we buy more, or we have so much cash in our hands. So let's say this is D. So what will be the new consumer surplus? CS3 will be equals to P. Remember, it is always below the demand curve. So P3 AD. So that is the consumer surplus for us, and it is equally illustrated when price is increasing or when price is reducing. Very, very important. How or what is the producer surplus? Producer surplus, as you can see on the board, equally refers to the difference between the price producers are willing and able to supply a good or a service and the price they actually receive in the market. So on the diagram, we now illustrate this using a supply curve. So when we are talking about consumer surplus, we use a demand curve. When we are talking about producer surplus, we use a supply curve. So this is how a supply curve slopes upward from left to right. And on this supply curve, you will bear with me that below this price P1, producers are willing to supply their good, whatever good it is. They are willing to supply it. But upon reaching the market, they realize that price has risen from what they were willing to supply to P1. That makes them to have a surplus. So for example, maybe they were willing to supply their good maybe at a price of 500, but upon reaching the market, the price has increased to 1,000. What is the surplus there? 500 francs, of course. So to illustrate this, let's say the producer surplus PS1 on this curve is P1 B BA. P1 BA. Why? Because it is the portion above the supply curve and below the price line. The portion above the supply curve and below the price line. So that is our producer surplus. What again will happen if price increase or reduce with the producer surplus? Let's say price increase to P2. Producers are happy. Remember, producers are always happy when price increases. So they will supply more, of course. So this will equally lead to an increase in the portion of the producer surplus. Remember, it is always the portion above the supply curve but below the price line. So we are going to be having the new producer surplus. Excuse me. The new producer surplus will be P2. Let's say this is C. P2CA. P2CA. Okay. Now what happens if the price drops? P3. Remember, when price drops, producers are not always happy. So since they are not happy, let's say this portion is D. The new producer surplus producer surplus 3. Sorry, this is producer surplus 2, which will be equals to this. Okay. Producer surplus 3 now will be the portion P3 DA. P3DA. Okay, that is it. Remember, when talking about consumer surplus, we look at the curve of the demand curve. When talking about producer surplus, we look at the supply curve, and you need to master where they belong. Now, that is not all. Looking at consumer and producer surplus, it can equally not be looked at individual levels like this. It can be looked from the level of the aggregate or the market. So the market now has to do with the forces of the demand and supply. So a curve can be given to you like this in the exam, and you are asked to show the portion of the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. So remember, if you are given a diagram like this, the consumer surplus is always a portion below the demand curve and above the price line. So let's say here we have P1. This will be our consumer surplus, above the price line but below the demand curve. Okay, so what about the producer surplus? It is a portion always above the supply curve but below the price line. So that's said and done. We come back to a very, very important concept known as community surplus, or what we call society surplus. The combination of this producer surplus and consumer surplus always give us what we call community surplus. So if you are asked what is community surplus, simply put, it is the combination of the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. So today we were looking at consumer surplus and producer's surplus. Very, very important. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.